Chapter 3, Section 2. Section 2, New Empires in India. While two religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, spread through India, there was little political unity. Between 1500 and 400 BC, warring kingdoms and shifting alliances prevented a lasting peace. 3 new empires. After 400 BC, India faced threats from invaders. First came Persia, which extended its empire into western India. Then came the Greeks and Macedonians. Alexander the Great had heard of the riches of India. After conquering Persia, he swept into India in 327 BC, but his soldiers refused to continue fighting. His army departed almost as quickly as it came. Alexander's conquests in western India, however, gave rise to the first Indian empire, the Mauryan Empire. The new Indian state was founded by Chandragupta Maurya, who ruled from 324 to 301 BC. He drove out the foreign forces and established the capital of his new Mauryan Empire in northern India at Pataliputra, modern Patna, in the Ganges Valley. According to the Arthasastra, a political text written by a Mauryan court official, it is power and power alone which, only when exercised by the king with impartiality, maintains both this world and the next. The king divided his empire into provinces, ruled by governors he appointed. According to Megasthenes, the Greek ambassador to the Mauryan court, Chandragupta Maurya was always afraid of assassination, despite having a large army and a secret police. All food was tasted in his presence, and he made a practice of never sleeping 2 nights in a row in the same bed in his large palace. The Mauryan Empire flourished during the reign of Ashoka, the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya. Ashoka is generally considered to be the greatest ruler in the history of India. After his conversion to Buddhism, Ashoka used Buddhist ideals to guide his rule. He set up hospitals for the welfare of both people and animals. He ordered that trees and shelters be placed along the road to provide shade and rest for weary travelers. Ashoka was more than a kind ruler. His kingdom prospered as India's role in regional commerce expanded. India became a major crossroads in a trade network that extended from the rim of the Pacific to Southwest Asia and the Mediterranean Sea. After Ashoka's death in 232 BC, the Mauryan Empire began to decline. In 183 BC, the last Mauryan ruler was killed by one of his military leaders, and India fell into disunity. The Kushan Empire. After the collapse of the Mauryan Empire, a number of new kingdoms arose along the edges of India in Bactria, known today as Afghanistan. In the 1st century AD, nomadic warriors seized power and established the new Kushan Empire. For the next 2 centuries, the Kushan spread over northern India as far as the central Ganges Valley. In the rest of India, other kingdoms fought for control. The Kushans prospered from the trade that passed through their empire between the Mediterranean countries and the countries bordering the Pacific Ocean. Most of that trade was between the Roman Empire and China. It was shipped along the route known as the Silk Road, so called because silk was China's most valuable product. One section of the Silk Road passed through the mountains northwest of India. The Silk Road, which had arisen between 200 BC and AD 100, reached from the city of Chang'an in China across Central Asia to Mesopotamia. The route covered a distance of about 4,000 miles, 6,436 kilometers, and wound through mountains and deserts, ending at Antioch in Syria, a port city on the Mediterranean Sea. At Antioch, luxury goods from the west were traded for luxury goods from the east, which were then shipped across the Mediterranean to Greece and Rome. Only luxury goods were carried on the Silk Road because camel caravans were difficult, dangerous, and thus expensive. Chinese merchants made large fortunes by trading luxury goods such as silk, spices, teas, and porcelain. Indian merchants sent ivory, textiles, precious stones, and pepper. These were exchanged for woolen and linen clothes, glass, and precious stones from the Roman Empire. Silk was especially desired by the Romans, who considered it worth its weight in gold. In fact, the Romans knew China as Sarika, which means land of silk. The Empire of the Guptas. The Kushan kingdom came to an end in the 3rd century AD, when invaders from Persia overran it. In 320, a new state was created in the central Ganges Valley by a local prince named Chandragupta, no relation to the earlier Chandragupta Maurya. He located his capital at Pataliputra, the site of the decaying palace of the Mauryas. His successor, his son Samudragupta, expanded the empire into surrounding areas. A court official wrote of Samudragupta that, primary source, he was skillful in waging hundreds of battles with only the strength of his arms. The beauty of his charming body was enhanced by the number of wounds caused by the blows of battle axes, arrows, spears, pikes, barbed darts, swords, lances, javelins, iron arrows, and many other weapons. Court official. Eventually, the new kingdom of the Guptas became the dominant political force throughout northern India. It also established loose control over central India, thus becoming the greatest state in India since the Mauryan Empire. Under a series of efficient monarchs, especially Chandragupta II, who reigned from 375 to 415, the Gupta Empire created a new age of Indian civilization. The Gupta Empire actively engaged in trade with China, Southeast Asia, and the Mediterranean, and also encouraged domestic trade in cloth, salt, and iron. Cities famous for their temples as well as for their prosperity rose along the main trade routes throughout India. Much of the trade in the Gupta Empire was managed by the Gupta rulers, who owned silver and gold mines and vast lands. They earned large profits from their dealings. They lived in luxury, awakening to the sound of music and spending much time in dining with followers and guests. It was said that the king and his companions drank wine out of ruby cups while lutes were strummed. Much of their wealth came from religious trade as pilgrims, people who traveled to religious places, from across India and as far away as China, came to visit the major religious centers. The greatness of Indian culture was reported by a Chinese traveler, Kushan, who spent several years there in the 5th century. A Buddhist monk, he visited India in search of documents about the teachings of the Buddha. In his writings, Kushan describes the Gupta rulers, their practice of Buddhism, and the prosperity of the empire. Primary source. Beyond the deserts are the territories of western India. The kings of these territories are all firm believers in the law of the Buddha. They remove their caps of state when they make offerings to the priests. The members of the royal household and the chief ministers personally direct the food giving. When the distribution of food is over, they spread a carpet on the ground and sit down before it. Southward from this is the so-called middle country. The people are very well off, without poll tax or official restrictions. Only those who farm the royal lands return a portion of profit of the land to the king. If they desire to go, they go. If they like to stop, they stop. The kings govern without corporal punishment. Criminals are fined according to circumstances, lightly or heavily. Even in cases of repeated rebellion, they only cut off the right hand. In this country they do not keep swine nor fowls, and do not deal in cattle. They have no shambles or wine shops in their marketplaces. Fashion, describing life under the Guptas. The good fortunes of the Guptas did not last. Beginning in the late 5th century AD, invasions by nomadic Huns from the northwest gradually reduced the power of the empire. A military commander briefly revived the empire in the middle of the 7th century, but after his death the empire collapsed. North India would not be reunited for hundreds of years. Indian accomplishments. Literature. Few cultures are as rich and varied as India. Its literature reflects that. The earliest known Indian literature are the Vedas, which contain religious chants and stories. Originally passed down orally from generation to generation, the Vedas were recorded in Sanskrit after the development of writing. India's great epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, were also put into written form about 100 BC. Both of these works tell of the legendary deeds of great warriors. The Mahabharata, consisting of over 90,000 stanzas or lines of poetry, is the longest poem in any written language. Taking place around 1000 BC, it describes a war between cousins for control of the kingdom. The most famous section of the book, called the Bhagavad Gita, is a sermon by the god Krishna on the eve of a major battle. In this sermon, he sets forth one of the key points of Indian society. In taking action, one must not worry about success or failure. One should only be aware of the moral rightness of the act itself. The Ramayana, written at about the same time, is much shorter than the Mahabharata. It is an account of the fictional ruler Rama. As a result of a palace plot, Rama is banished from the kingdom and forced to live in the forest. Later, he fights the demon king of Ceylon, who has kidnapped his beloved wife Sita. Like the Mahabharata and most works of the ancient world, the Ramayana is strongly imbued with religious and moral lessons. Rama is seen as the ideal hero, a perfect ruler and ideal son. Sita projects the supreme duty of wifely loyalty to her husband. To this day, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana continue to inspire the people of India. One of ancient India's most famous authors from the Gupta era was Kalidasa. His poem, The Cloud Messenger, remains one of the most popular Sanskrit poems. In the poem, an exiled male earth spirit shares his grief and longing for his wife. Architecture. Some of the earliest examples of Indian architecture stem from the time of Ashoka, when Buddhism became the state religion. The desire to spread the ideas of Gautama Buddha inspired the great architecture of the Mauryan dynasty and the period that followed. The three main types of structures, all serving religious purposes, were the pillar, the stupa, and the rock chamber. During Ashoka's reign, many stone pillars were erected along roads to mark sites of events in the Buddha's life. The polished sandstone pillars weighed up to 50 tons, 45.4 metric tons each, and rose as high as 50 feet, 15 meters. Each was topped with a carved lion, uttering the Buddha's message. A stupa was originally meant to house a relic of the Buddha, such as a lock of his hair. These structures were built in the form of burial mounds. Eventually, the stupa became a place for devotion and the most familiar form of Buddhist architecture. Each stupa rose to considerable heights and was surmounted by a spire. According to legend, Ashoka ordered the construction of 84,000 stupas throughout India. The final development in early Indian architecture was the rock chamber, carved out of rock cliffs. This structure was developed by Ashoka to provide a series of rooms to house monks and to serve as a hall for religious ceremonies. Science and mathematics. Ancient Indians possessed an impressive amount of scientific knowledge, particularly in astronomy. They charted the movements of the stars and recognized that Earth was a sphere that rotated on its axis and revolved around the sun. Their most important contribution was in the field of mathematics. Aryabhata, the most famous mathematician of the Gupta Empire, was one of the first scientists known to have used algebra. Indian mathematicians also introduced the concept of zero and used a symbol, zero, for it. After Arabs conquered parts of India in the 8th century AD, Arab scholars adopted the Indian system. In turn, European traders borrowed it from the Arabs, and it spread through Europe in the 1200s. Today, it is called the Indian Arabic Numerical System.